welcome. It's really nice to see so many of you here today. My name is Nadia Khan, and I am a historian, an author, and the founder of Golden Threads, which is a project which I'm hosting Sam under today. It's a project that explores the history, culture, and heritage across the Islamic world and beyond. I have a master's in history and I specialize in Indian partition, so the book was really resonating with me, and actually I learned so much, more than from when I studied. My debut book, Dance Histories: A Journey Across the Muslim Silk Road, it uncovers traditions and stories connected to the often forgotten and orientalized Muslim dance heritage, connecting the past with the present, and seeing how dance has evolved, but also how it's kept its spiritual core. I also write, I'm a book blogger, I host cultural events and collaborate with artists and writers such as George the Poet, Layla Abu Layla, Fatima Manji, and more recently Michelle Hussein, who I interviewed in his very building a few months ago. And through my work with Golden Threads, I'm really passionate about re-establishing lost connections and bringing hidden histories to life through storytelling talks and workshops. So I'm really, really excited and pleased to have you here today. Really big welcome to you, Sam Dalrymple. So let me introduce Sam to all of you. He is a historian, a filmmaker, and author of Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions, and the Making of Modern Asia. Sam grew up in Delhi and he studied Persian and Sanskrit at Oxford. And at Oxford, he set up the Silk Road Society, which is really interesting. And then also in 2018, he co-founded Project Dastan, which is a brilliant initiative that connects partition refugees with their ancestral homelands across the border using virtual reality and letting them see where they once lived, the places of worship that they used to go to, the shops they used to go to, the street they lived on, and I think it's just really needed. And Sam's work has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Time Magazine, and his films include Child of Empire, which premiered at the Sundance Festival, and Lost Migrations, which sold out at the British Film Institute. So his debut book, Shattered Lands, is already an international bestseller, and it's a sweeping history of how the British Raj, once stretching from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia, was torn apart into 12 modern nations through 5 partitions, not the one that we always hear about, which is India and Pakistan. So it's a story of identity, of belonging, of ethno-nationalism, and how history impacts us in the modern day. And it's told through vivid archival history and oral histories. Sam reframes the story of partition. So rather than focusing only on India and Pakistan, he shows how these 5 partitions lead us to rethink a lot of what we thought we knew, or what I thought I knew. And also to question, some of the questions that I was thinking about was, the creation of Pakistan has been quite vilified in historical narratives and Indian nationalist narratives for breaking up a united India. And this narrative depicts Pakistan as the only nation that wanted self-determination, when there were so many others that wanted and did the same, and to this day still want that. So Sam talks about the history of the British Raj and how it had been a vast, interconnected world of shared trade, coexistence of diverse faiths and family and neighborly ties. But partition tore it apart, leaving behind borders, hostility, and suspicion. The theme of what is identity is a running thread through the book, and we see how rapidly new identities were formed, new stories and narratives created, and how history was erased and continues to be erased. Violence and upheaval, sadly, were commonplace during this time, as was forced displacement and refugee crises. And yet, amidst the violence, there is some hope that Sam sort of puts across in the book, that there are stories of families who sheltered neighbours, of friends who helped others escape, and individuals who defied hatred. And towards the end of the book, Sam, you say partition is not over. Its legacies live on in Burma's Rohingya crisis, in Kashmir, in the disputes we almost had, we had a war with India and Pakistan recently, in the alienation of minorities that continues in South Asia. So really, to understand today's conflicts and displacement of people, we have to know about the holistic history and be aware of these 5 partitions, not just the one that reshaped the region. So really, I find, Sam, your book is just so essential in the study of this period, and it makes us all rethink the history, and also a lot of things start to make sense. And I wanted to just start by asking you really to give us an overview of the book. What were these 5 partitions that you speak about, and what sparked your interest into looking into the history of this period?
Sure. Thank you so much all for coming, and thanks for that lovely introduction. So the thing that got me first working on this was working with Project Astan. There was a conversation which I had at university with some friends, and this strange realization that, you know, sitting at university together, we had in a room a Brit, an Indian, and a Pakistani, all mates, all hang out on an evening, and that was impossible in South Asia itself, tragically. And there was this strange realization that, you know, my friend Sparsh, whose family came from what's now Pakistan, quite near Jhang, in West Punjab, and Amina, whose family came from what's now Hoshiarpur in East Punjab, and for both of them, their homes had essentially become lost to them on the other side of the border. Their family had migrated away 78 years ago, and they had no idea what their ancestral home actually looked like, and what the community around it was like, etc. And so often in these narratives we talk about homes being lost to us, but of course it's not lost, it's there, it's still there on the other side. And for Amina, getting to Sparsh's ancestral home was a matter of a 2-hour drive. And for Sparsh, getting to Amina's ancestral home was a 4-hour drive. Very easy, not difficult at all, but because of the visa regime. So we started Project Astan, started reconnecting people. So the idea is that we would send a team out, we'd interview some families about where they came from, what they wanted to see again on the other side of the border. And then we'd send another team out on the other side of the border with virtual reality cameras to scan your old masjid, your old mandir, your old house, your old school, so that, you know, a 95-year-old auntie who's desperate to see her old childhood home again can go walk through her old streets. And often we manage to reconnect old friends. One of the things that very quickly became evident, though, so a lot of the earlier interviews that we did were just based on who reached out to us over Instagram, to be completely honest. But like once we began to take this more seriously, we had this idea of taking back 75 people before the 75th anniversary. In the event, we only managed about 30 because COVID suddenly showed up and 2 years was wiped out. But we very quickly realized we wanted more diversity. Firstly, most people tended to be kind of upper caste, the type of people who had easy mobility, but also they tended to be from major urban centres, and particularly Punjab, where both India and Pakistan's kind of political centres are Islamabad and Delhi, which are both very Punjabi places. So we decided to try and expand, and particularly we were expanding into northeast India, which had huge levels of refugees, Hindu refugees who fled East Pakistan and went that direction essentially during the partition in the east, which is very often overlooked, that the whole Bangladesh side of partition, even within Bangladesh, it's overshadowed by the 71 war, and so very few people tend to look into it. And it was when we were chatting with a family from Tripura that I asked, how partition affected their area, and they said, which partition? And that made me kind of pause, 2, 3, what do you mean? And they said, well, there's the 1937 partition when Burma was separated and suddenly we couldn't get to Rangoon anymore. Then there was the 1947 partition when suddenly we were cut off from Dhaka, which became East Pakistan, and then we saw yet another wave of refugees come in 1971 when suddenly East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and yet again there was another wave of displacement. And viewed from northeast India, there were three. And so that's the origins of this book, and it got me thinking, kind of, particularly the whole Burma thing. I think Bangladesh and Pakistan both very much featured in my imagination of partition, but Burma is there on every map of the Raj, and no one ever questions why the hell Burma's there. And Burma, what's that about? But I think a lot of people just assume it's some kind of strange administrative nicety, but it wasn't. It was very much a core part of Indian identity, as I go into in the book. And the more that I tried to basically research, okay, what did the Raj actually look like in the 20s? And the response was completely counterintuitive, because although we tend to imagine British India as roughly modern India plus Pakistan and Bangladesh, what became British India was essentially just a random group of conquests made by the British East India Company that was then nationalised in 1858. And so everywhere that this random company has conquered, all suddenly becomes India. And when it's nationalised, when the East India Company is nationalised, they shave off the bits that are really far away. So I think Somalia and Hong Kong and Singapore had also been conquered by the East India Company, but they decided, okay, we'll let those be separate British colonies. But for the next 100 years, under the Raj, until the early 1920s, modern Yemen and modern Burma were also part of the Raj, and there's a passport I found of this Yemeni Jewish woman from Aden in what's now southern Yemen. She's trying to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration declares it part of a holy a homeland for the Jewish people, and in order to migrate there from Yemen, she has to do so on an Indian passport, because by virtue of her being born in Aden, she is an Indian citizen. And so if you can just hold this for a second, the basic map of the Raj that I came to is essentially this. It's this vast empire within an empire that stretched from what's now Yemen to what's now Burma, and includes Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It's a much vaster story, the breakup of the Raj, than we tend to imagine. And of course, not all of it was ever under direct Indian rule. About a third of this territory was run by princely states. So these are states like Kashmir, these are states like Jaipur, like Hyderabad, like Bhavalpur, Chitral, everywhere that there's a Maharaja or a Nawab or a Nizam, these sort of areas, these semi-independent kingdoms that had given up their foreign policy and their internal defence to the Raj, but were otherwise independent, essentially, internally. And if you look at the list of princely states that was subservient to the Viceroy, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi, and then goes on to list Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, etc. And so there's this whole kind of Gulf angle. In fact, the reason that the Gulf states exist to this day is that they were essentially the bits of the Arabian Peninsula, the little sheikdoms that were protected by the Indian army when in the 1920s Ibn Saud unites all of the Arabian tribes and forms Saudi Arabia. So in some sense they only exist as separate to Saudi Arabia thanks to the protection of the Indian army and thanks to the Viceroy's protectorates over these regions. So the story that I tell in this book is how in the 1920s you have this vast empire within an empire. It's a quarter of the world's population count as Indian. And this includes the largest Hindu, Sikh, Muslim and Zoroastrian populations on the planet. And between 1937 and 1971, there's 5 moments of rupture that tear it apart into the 12 nation states that we see today on the map. It begins, rather unexpectedly, with the separation of Burma, which feels a bit like, the debates over Burma separation feel a bit like Brexit. It had basically attracted migrants from the rest of the Raj to the point that technically, in the 1920s, the Burmese dream was larger than the American dream. You had more migrants sailing across the Bay of Bengal because the economy was thriving. It was the richest province of the Raj. More migrants sailing across the Bay of Bengal to Rangoon than anywhere, than across the Atlantic Ocean to New York. But this creates huge anti-immigration sentiment, and when the Great Depression happens in the 1930s, a bunch of Tamil bankers seize as collateral a bunch of land, and eventually I think a quarter of all Burmese agricultural land becomes owned in the course of 6 years by these Tamil bankers. And this creates a huge anti-immigration backlash, and there's a big move to separate Burma off. Around the same time, you have Hindu nationalists saying that we want Bharat, this holy land that's mentioned in the Hindu epics, to be the future Indian nation. And so they're actively both suggesting that Burma be cut off and suggesting that the Arabian states be cut off. And so that happens gradually as the second partition from 1937 to 1947. You gradually see each of these Gulf states removed from the Viceroy's purview and becoming protectorates of Whitehall rather than protectorates of New Delhi. And this means that when all of the other princely states are hoovered up by India and Pakistan, these states, the Gulf states remain independent. Now the third of the partitions is the great one we all know, the division of British India into India and Pakistan. And this creates, as we know, the largest forced migration in human history. You have something between 12 and 15 million Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims all forced to migrate across the border, with Hindus and Sikhs leaving Pakistan for India and Muslims leaving India for Pakistan. But the fourth partition that I talk about is the fact that some 80% of the modern India-Pakistan border, if we include the line of control, is not determined by the British lawyer Cyril Radcliffe. We call the border the Radcliffe Line because he was put in charge of dividing Punjab and dividing Bengal. But he did not draw the whole line, because most of that border was determined by the 20 princely states, those Maharajas and Nawabs and Nizams, whose states fell along the border, and the princely states were not divided on the basis of religion. This is the origin of the crisis over Kashmir, which ultimately comes down to, is it the Maharaja's choice, the Maharaja, Hindu Maharaja, Muslim majority population? The Maharaja wants to join India, the population is never given a vote, and most people think it probably would have wanted to join Pakistan. That is a classic example of a border state that's caught in between. And so the partition of princely India results in a huge proportion of that border being drawn. And then the fifth partition that I talk about is the creation of Bangladesh from Pakistan, the independence in 1971 after one of the most bloody conflicts of the 20th century, and one that I think is, most Bangladeshis always know and talk about, but I think out in both India and Pakistan, it's reduced to an India-Pakistan war rather than like one of the central events, along with 1947, that has reshaped the map of modern South Asia.
So just on that, in the book you say that all the lands within the Raj had been connected by trade, marriage and faith long before the British had ever arrived. And until the 20th century, even religious boundaries in the region were fluid. So just building on what you were saying about all these regions that were under the British Raj, what did that mean in reality? So was there like ease of movement, shared culture? Could you just give us an idea of what that meant?
Sure. So before the Brits show up, there's a series of kingdoms and empires that at various points tie together different parts of the region. Now crucially, I think a lot of people don't associate the Gulf with the subcontinent and assume that that connection began under the Brits, which it's definitely turbocharged under the Brits, but there are maritime trade connections going back centuries. And I think Kerala's the first Muslim king from Kerala is actually buried in modern Oman, I believe. And you get all of these crazy connections. And yes, the boundaries between religions were very fluid. As late as the 1910s, you have, most Punjabi Khatri families will raise their eldest son as a Sikh, but then the rest of their kids as Hindus. The first biography of the Prophet Muhammad in Bengal talks about him, Muhammad, as an avatar of Niranjana, which these first Bengali translations use this kind of Hindu terminology to refer to Allah, to try and basically make it more understandable to the local population, this new faith that's arising. In Kerala, in the south, you had, I think there was the youngest son. If you decided to stop having kids, the youngest son would become a Muslim, even though most of the family was Hindu, so as to trade with the Gulf. Because as Muslims, they could go and trade across the sea. And so you have these multi-faith families. And so there were these very fluid religious boundaries. That doesn't mean that everything was great, fine, and dandy. There is, throughout history, all sorts of conflict that emerges. You can see it in a lot of the early mosques in South Asia are conquest mosques that were built from the ruins of Hindu temples. That is a very real sort of political issue in India today. Yet at the same time, under the Mughal Emperor Akbar, he tries to create essentially a new religion called the Din-e-Ilahi that will kind of bring together Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and everyone else. And so there's a kind of fascinating array, and it's not as divided necessarily. And by the time that the Brits show up, you very happily have the Sikh kingdom of Ranjit Singh being almost a Muslim majority empire. We often forget it wasn't a Sikh majority empire, it was Muslim majority. The Mughal Empire was Hindu majority. All of these kingdoms were not and most of the leading Maratha generals were Muslims. And today, actually the only Muslim state that survived in Rajasthan into the 20th century had been founded by the Marathas, supposedly the great Hindu nationalists before British Empire begins. So none of these kingdoms in South Asia's history before the Brits were ever monoliths. And so that's the world that Britain essentially enters into.
Yes. And because before this event, I was doing some clips of your book on my social media, and then I said that quote that you said about how there was that fluidity and all of that, and then had some comments saying that's a lie, it was never like that. And this is why it's so important for us to know this history, because it really just changes the whole way that you look at everything and how things are today. So just on the part of Burma, you were speaking about Burma, even I had no clue that it was part of British Raj, so that was a big surprise to me. And actually, there are a significant number of Indians living there. And then it's like, now I see everywhere, now that I've read your book, the connections. So one of my cousins is married to a Gujarati Muslim, and they visited from the States recently, and then he said how his family were from Burma, and his dad, and they all speak Burmese, and I was like, what? This I didn't even think to ask. And then, the last Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar II was exiled to Rangoon, and then because of what happened with this anti-Muslim, anti-Indian sentiment that was happening around this time, where Burma wanted to be independent and forced displacement of hundreds and thousands of Indians, Bahadur Shah Zafar's family was also exiled, which is all really interesting, and it all makes sense, the connections. So why is that refugee crisis, because when you talk about it in the book, it's very impactful, it's very large. How severe was it, and why did it happen? Also, just what was interesting for me that you said, because you do talk about India, Pakistan, the partition there, and the role of Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, very much the main political players at the time. And there's this, we all know that Jinnah started off as an Indian nationalist, and he wanted a united India. He was very much advocating for that. And then he changed, and a lot of people question, why did he change? Was it just a political convenience? What was it? And you actually say that what was happening in Burma, so around leading up to 1937, and all these Muslims, there was sort of like an Islamophobia happening there, and they're being exiled. And Jinnah, you said, that was one of the reasons where he said, this is why Muslims need to be safeguarded.
So yeah, I think that there is a complete lack of awareness today, quite the extent that the idea of Pakistan was based off of events in Burma. And today the two are seen as completely separate, yet, for example, the reason that the Burmese state becomes so paranoid about the Rohingya minority is because most of the Rohingya were early Pakistani nationalists who then end up on the Burmese side of the border. So they had been Muslim Leaguers, a lot of the major Rohingya politicians in the 1930s. And so they become seen as potentially kind of dubious loyalty. And yeah, there's more of that in the book. But you know, there are calls in the 1940s for Rohingya areas to be attached to Pakistan. And that is one of the reasons why the government later opposed them. What happens is that in 1937, after a lot of political debate, Burma is separated off in the first partition. And very quickly, a series of very xenophobic politicians basically take control in Burma. Remember that although the Brits are still ruling, the Brits are trying to hand the reins gradually to self-rule. And so there are sort of, you know, non-British politicians running provincial affairs, even if they're not given access to, you know, the Raja's defence as a whole. There's no Indians at the top of the Indian army yet, but the local premier of Punjab, Burma, etc. will by this point be a non-white European. So what happens is this guy called Usul comes to power and begins essentially an attempt of ethnic cleansing. Gradually he comes to power on a campaign to push Indians out. Remember, by this point, Tamils own 30% of land in Burma. There's a big, growing anti-South Asian sentiment. And at the same time, it's tied in with anti-Muslim sentiment. This leads to several anti-Indian pogroms, which culminates in a series of laws that, you know, Indians cannot marry Burmese, you can't have interfaith marriages in Burma, etc. This creates huge tension, so that by the time that World War II happens, the Japanese invade, and, you know, this is after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are invading the British Empire, the Brits basically flee, and the Indian population worried that now that the Brits are gone, they're going to be lynched, essentially. There's a massive worry that they're going to be lynched. And so what you see in between, I think it's 1942, I think it's 366,000 Indians set off in what's known as the Long March. At that point, one of the largest refugee crises ever recorded in history. And it's completely forgotten in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today. And yet, the consequences are everywhere. So you get all these people migrating on foot, often through the jungles of Southeast Asia. And as a result, you get essentially the first time that people really grapple with a refugee crisis. This is a direct influence on Jinnah. Though these anti-Muslim, specifically pogroms, he sees as justification for why there need to be legal protections for minorities in a future independent state. He explicitly says this, and you actually see, interestingly, I think it's even Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, who comes up with the word Pakistan. He's the Cambridge student who coins the term Pakistan. In that first text that ever mentions the word Pakistan, he says the sentence, "If Burma is being separated from India, I do not see why the Muslims of what I think should be Pakistan should be forced into it." So the very first justification for Pakistan's existence ever is in relation to what's happening in Burma, and yet somehow we've forgotten this. They're very closely tied together, and it's, you know, the first partition and the later partition. But I think somehow because... So firstly, I think that Jinnah, Nehru and Gandhi aren't really present that much in the politics of the early 1930s in the same way as they later become. And so when they're writing the history books of their new nations, they don't really include these events because it's a different set of politicians.
It's convenient to sort of, it doesn't fit into the narrative that they
Doesn't fit in the narrative, and also the history books that they're writing after the Great Partition of 1947, so that is at the forefront of their minds, and so somehow this is completely overshadowed. What is 366,000 people displaced compared to 15 million? And so you know, there is not a single memorial in the world to those who died in the Long March. There's a couple of individual ones. I went to Rangoon recently, in Yangon now, in Myanmar, not Burma. But you can go to the Armenian church and there's a small plaque for the members of their parish who never made it in the Long March, who all died en route. And there's this one plaque that I've found anywhere in South Asia, and it's actually in Rangoon, to those who passed away. But that's it. That's all I've managed to find so far. And it's in the local Armenian church, and it records 12 Armenian families who died en route. So again, not even necessarily, decent, but yeah.
And just on that topic of this theory of like the undivided India, and in the book you say, in reality, this undivided India was itself a colonial construct, existing only for 5 months in 1947, following the overlooked partitions of Burma and Arabia. Hindu nationalism was a key driving force in these earlier partitions, envisioning an independent India that resembled the ancient Hindu holy land of Bharat. So the main sort of story that's told is that partition was the fault of the British and Muslim nationalism, these Muslims that wanted to break away and divide India, with Pakistan being the villain in Indian nationalist narratives. But your research shows other forces at play, like Hindu nationalism and the idea of Bharat. Why has that narrative of just Pakistan dominated, and how can your work really change our understanding of partition? Because really knowing about all of this makes you look at it in a totally different light. And it's not a simple thing that happened, it's complex. And this Hindu nationalism you talk about, the ancient holy land of Bharat, Burma wasn't part of those borders, which is why, from what you said, that partitioning off wasn't really a problem, and Gandhi actually encouraged it.
So I think that the key thing to understand is that all of these religious nationalisms emerge at roughly the same time and are in some symbiosis with each other. Buddhist nationalism too, again, remember Burma is part of the play. And so Hindu nationalism, Buddhist nationalism and Muslim nationalism all emerge at a similar time in reaction to one another. And they're all very, very interlinked. So what you were mentioning earlier, for those who haven't read the book, in the 1920s, one of the things that really surprises a lot of people who read it is that the leading Burmese politician, Mahatma Ottama, who was a disciple of Gandhi's, he spends years campaigning for Burma to remain part of India. He believes in that the entirety of the Raj from Aden to Rangoon should get independence from the British, but as a united thing, and that Burma can be part of this future Indian nation. Gandhi, on the other hand, arrives and completely disagrees. He wants an independent nation state that resembles the geographical boundaries of Bharat. And Bharatvarsh is this. It's not a 20th century idea. It's a very, very ancient idea. You can see it from about 1000 BC. It's arguably the first geographical word that's used, that we know of, that's used to refer to the subcontinent and that's indigenous to the subcontinent. And it refers to the area that basically shows up in the ancient Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. And this is the great battle between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and this great, it's the kind of the Odyssey or the Iliad of South Asia. And there it talks about all of these regions across the subcontinent joining together in this great war and in this land called Bharat. And so when Gandhi is trying to talk about the nation that he wants to carve out from the British Empire, he is talking about the geography of that. And this is a geography that roughly is equivalent to India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but does not include Burma and does not include the Arabian states. And so you actually have in the 1920s several different ideas of what could get independence from British. Everyone has pretty much agreed that the Brits have to go, but there's a remarkable divergence of opinion over what that should look like. There's at least, so in the Arabian states probably feel the least Indian. There's still a lot of loyalty to these individual kingdoms, essentially. So, Oman, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and you are a subject of the Sheikh, and that kind of thing. But in the city of Aden, in what's now southern Yemen, there was this whole intellectual class of people, including this wonderful man, Muhammad Ali Luqman. And Luqman, it becomes one of the great writers in Yemeni history. he starts this newspaper called Fatat Al Jazeera. He starts several newspapers, in fact, and his kids and grandkids are still major newspaper writers to this day across the Gulf. He, in the 1920s, talks about how much of the population of Aden, how many of the Arabs of the city, had begun to consider themselves Indian nationalists. They joined the Indian National Congress. Luqman becomes a travelling companion with one of the great Indian nationalist leaders, Ambedkar, who's the great Dalit leader. And so there is this sense in the 1920s, which is why I want to start my book there. 1971 is the last moment, it is the last time that a new border cuts through the landscape. But 5 decades earlier, in 1921, is the last time that you really get people from Rangoon to Aden all potentially wanting a unified nation state and wanting to inherit, in a sense, the imperial scaffolding that Britain had constructed. They understand that this is a region that's rather arbitrary, but they have a shared experience of British colonialism, and there is a sense that politicians from across this region could potentially work together as a united front, and gain independence together. And then all the other, and so you get Nehru in this period talking about wanting a United States of South Asia, and you could have and as late as 1946, Jinnah is still, I think, I don't buy the idea that Jinnah was campaigning for Pakistan as a bargaining chip. I think he wanted a Pakistan, but I think the Pakistan that he had in mind was more like how Scotland is a separate nation with its own parliament within the United Kingdom. He always talks about nations, but he never once uses the idea of nation state. He says that Pakistan needs to be identified as a nation. And he, in 1946, is willing for Pakistan to be part of a federation proposed by the cabinet mission in 1946. So I think that's what he was actually after.
I agree. I was going to ask you that actually. So there is this rise of nationalisms, Burma. We've got the rise of the RSS, the Hindu nationalist movement, and so it just made me think. Loads of people in the princely states, they are happy living, with the community that they know. And it doesn't always mean the same religion. So I've often thought, because I definitely think that the Pakistan that was created wasn't what Jinnah wanted or had in mind. Even Muhammad Iqbal, the poet, wanted self-determination for Muslims, and a lot of that was for them to be able to practice their religion and culture freely. So when the cabinet mission in 46 proposed a federal structure, Jinnah was going to agree with that. And I often have thought whether people ask, do you think India and Pakistan should have been separated, right? I think that a federal structure, and I want to know what you think about this, would have been more suited to India because of the way its diversity, the way it was structured, how big it was. Having this sort of independent nation, modern nation states being imposed on them, almost like, like colonial, doing it the way the colonialists want you to do it, would a federal structure have worked better?
Yeah.
Or would it have prevented nationalism?
I don't think we can ever know that. I think all of this is slight conjecture. I think that everyone who I know who's ever researched this topic, when reading through these potential ways that things could have gone in 1946, you could feel heartbroken because you know what's about to happen, but you also see how close they get to avoiding any violence whatsoever, and how close they came to creating some sort of united India. Of course, Burma and Arabia had already been separated by that point. The idea was that you would, Jinnah was very certain that Muslims needed constitutional guards to look after South Asian Muslims, the largest Muslim community in the world. There was a larger Muslim population in united India than there was in the entire Arab world put together at the time. I think Bengalis alone are the second largest Muslim ethnic group after Arabs, and so, when you put India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh together, it's enormous. But they were still second to the Hindu population. So the idea was that they would have a United Kingdom style system, but with 5 states. You would have East Pakistan, West Pakistan, which were both Muslim majority. You would have North India and South India, and then you would have the Deccan, which is central India that was kind of roughly mixed kind of Hindu-Muslim population. And yeah, I think that would have been a great system. Unfortunately, things broke down. I don't think that it's a clear-cut case of kind of anyone particularly to blame. It's kind of everyone's at fault. And this is, I think, one of the key takeaways is that there's no one villain, and it's very easy, I think, in all of these the reason that when you read the books, if you read an Indian book, it's always, oh, it was the Pakistanis. When you read the Pakistani books, it's all, oh, it was the Indians. Everyone blames the British. And in British books, kind of, they blame the Indians and the Pakistanis. It's kind of everyone. I think that what you can say is that the chaos that emerged was the result of the decisions of a very small number of basically men. And one of the things that is very clear is that this isn't, the chaos that emerges is not thanks to kind of, mass popular uprisings, etc. It does come down ultimately to the disagreements of Mountbatten, Jinnah, Nehru, Gandhi. There is a small group of people who, had they been able to work something out, history could look very different.
People love to throw poor Cyril Radcliffe under the bus. I think I've done that as well. And it was interesting to read that he only drew a very small part of the border, was it Punjab and Bengal, and the majorities from the princely states, and this decision they made whether to go to India or Pakistan. And on that decision, do you think they actually had a choice? Or was it always going to be interference from
the
princely states?
Yeah. Poor Cyril Radcliffe, fascinating figure. Bizarrely, after dividing so he is not put in charge with dividing British India. He is specifically put in charge of dividing the two provinces of Punjab and Bengal, and so it's only those borders that were actually drawn by him. The borders around Sindh, the borders around Sylhet, the borders around Rajasthan, he has nothing to do with. He's a rather he is rightly condemned for the rushed way that he did it, but he was also given 77 days and was a random civil servant who was basically roped into the thing, refused all payment, and ran away saying, I want no one to find me, and there are roughly 3 million people who want me dead. So he's a very kind of interesting figure. Bizarrely, his next job is restructuring the British Film Institute on Southbank. And so if you've ever been to the BFI, that was his next job. And it was very odd doing a Partition films released at the BFI, and we kind of realised the link halfway through our screening. So the crucial thing is that most of the border was not drawn by him, it was drawn by the princes who had the choice of which country they would join. There is much more agency, not with the general population, but with the elite aristocrats had a lot of agency in where their little princedoms would go. Do I think that they actually had a choice? Well, I think that some of them did. The continued existence of Nepal and Bhutan is evidence of that. They were princely states that managed to lobby their independence, and they are independent today. Likewise, Dubai and Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait are all princely states that got away. So I think to some extent, yes, we can imagine a world in which they were allowed to, but yes, there was definitely, in India and Pakistan, certain figures who refused to accept the independence of certain princely states, and it was kind of random which ones. But say, for example, the Indian government was not okay with Hyderabad in central India, in the Deccan, was not okay with having a giant independent state in its heart. And they were very clear about that from the outset. And so they were actually much more lenient towards some of the states that existed on the frontiers, that had borders with other countries or with the sea. They were more okay with that. There was still a lot of political conniving. But Kashmir, you do get the sense that in the early days, India's politicians were generally okay to let it remain independent. Yeah. Kashmir, Muslim majority population with large Hindu, Sikh and Buddhist populations in the south and east. Hindu Maharaja. And a close reading of the sources seems to suggest that what happened there was that the Maharaja tries to remain independent as Switzerland of the East, is his idea. Now, the Muslim League, when coming up with the idea of Pakistan, the K, it was an anagram, Punjab, Afghans, Kashmiris. Kashmiris were always a part of the Muslim League's idea of Pakistan, but
you said Jinnah was quite hands-off with it.
Jinnah was quite hands-off, as was the Indian government, but what seems to happen, they were all kind of okay with it remaining independent to some extent. What changes is that there's a series, the partition violence that's sweeping through Punjab at this point is pushed over the border into Jammu. And in Jammu there is a series of anti-Muslim pogroms that basically happen, and you get Jammu, which is now the kind of Hindu majority bit, was actually Muslim majority then, but all sorts of Muslims are not necessarily killed, but flee. And what you get is a series of members of the Pakistani army going behind the back of Jinnah to try and fund a militia to help bring Kashmir into the Pakistani fold so that they can protect these Muslims from further harm. And it's it's the sort of thing that happens so much throughout Pakistan's later history of the military going behind the back of the civilian government to try and do something. The Maharaja then cedes to India in self-defense. Gradually, both of the armies are pulled in, while still being able to blame the other as the aggressor. And the crucial thing, I think, is that the first violence probably isn't India or Pakistan sponsored, but is to do with the partition violence that's been sweeping across the country, spreading into Kashmir. And in this paranoid moment, convincing both of the leaders that the others are conniving behind their back and kind of doing all. And by the end of it, there is a lot of spies being sent over the border, etc. But there's far less of that in the early days than I think people realise.
And I just wanted to ask you about Arabia and Arab nationalism, actually. So there's this excellent review of your book by somebody called Shubhangi Shah in the week. And she said, imagine a world where the Arab elite studied in colleges and universities of Aligarh or Bombay and wore Indian-style sherwanis. Aden, the Indian Empire's westernmost bastion, like the rest of Indian Arabia, was governed as part of Bombay province, and everyone carried Indian currency and passports. So it's funny because then it becomes, and what we've got in the Gulf states at the moment is Indians are seen as, South Asians as second-class citizens. So how did this shift take place? And we're talking about nationalism within India, within Burma, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, growing everywhere. But then there's also this Arab nationalism growing. And where people might have identified, like I think you mentioned about the Sultan of Oman, and how he was educated actually in India and spoke Urdu and had titles given in
more
Urdu.
Fluent in Urdu than he was in Arabic, the Sultans of Oman in the 1920s and 30s, yeah.
Yeah, so then suddenly it's all changing and then it's just flipped around. So is this part of like just the growing nationalism movement? What's going on at this time?
So when the book opens in the 1920s, there's still this sense that Arab, potentially down the line, Arabs might be able to become an Indian ethnicity just like Telugus, Tamils, Kashmiris, Bengalis, Punjabis, etc. And that could just include Arab as another ethnicity of a country called India. Muhammad Ali Luqman, as I mentioned earlier, certainly seemed to be able to identify as an Indian nationalist. Things begin to change after World War I. Now, in World War I, there was the whole Arab revolt against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans, the Arabs across what's now kind of the Hijaz, what's now sort of Palestine, Syria, etc. There's that revolt, Lawrence of Arabia helping the Arabs get independence from the Ottoman Empire. in the middle of this, Indian nationalists see this kind of divide and rule British thing as the Brits trying to get rid of our caliph, and Sunni Muslims are rallying round the caliphate and saying, we don't want the caliphate to be abolished at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so a lot of Indian Muslims basically side with the Ottomans, whereas Luqman and a lot of the Arabs in Aden are very much on the side of the Arabs who were revolting against the Ottomans as colonialists. So for a lot of the Arabs in Aden, these Turkish rulers were colonial rulers in the same way as the Brits. Whereas in places like Aligarh, in places like Lucknow, in places like what's now Pakistan and Bangladesh, they tended to see the caliph as the kind of, rightful ruler of all of Sunni Islam and not see them so much as colonial rulers in their own right. And so there's a big divergence there that Luqman, in his autobiography, talks a lot about, that in the 1910s, he's very much, has exactly the same political beliefs as all of his Muslim contemporaries when he's a lecturer in Aligarh University. But then by the 1930s, he feels completely alienated by them because they all believe that that the Ottoman Empire should not be divided up and the Arabs should not be allowed to be independent of the Turks, essentially. And there's this whole weird, forgotten debates there within these different Muslim communities.
It's just amazing how it interrelates. And I remember in India they had the Khilafat movement in 1917, which was actually led by Gandhi as well. And then when you hear Jinnah's speeches around just before partition, and he speaks about it, he also speaks about Palestine. So there's this connection, although they're in South Asia, a much wider connection with the Muslim world. So we're going to go to audience questions in a minute, but I wanted to ask Sam to do a quick reading of the book.
Sure.
So if you could think about your questions, and we'll come to that in a minute.
So this is a section from the middle of the book when it's just been announced that the Raj is going to be partitioned along religious lines into India and Pakistan in 1947. We are, I think, in June 1947, so 2 months before independence. The partitions of Burma and Arabia had been planned meticulously over years. The Great Partition of 1947, by contrast, would be put together haphazardly over just 10 weeks. Civil servants and military officers raced to figure out not only which areas would belong to Pakistan, but how the military, the civil service, the banking and educational systems would be divided. Everything is moving so fast that it's difficult to keep track of things, wrote Shahid Hamid. Everyone is in a spin. There is no time to relax. It was a mad rush between the Congress and Muslim League to get as much as they could, and in the coming weeks the people of each Muslim majority province were asked to cast their vote on Pakistan. Muslim League National Guards and RSS cadres marched across the landscape, campaigning and intimidating voters from the back of boats, bicycles, trucks and camels. Bribery and political intimidation were endemic, and a soldier posted in Sylhet noted that pressure is already being brought to bear on Hindu voters in villages that they should cast their votes for Pakistan if they want to live in peace. Yet voters didn't divide along communal lines as much as one might have expected. Muslim preachers of the Jamaat ul-Ulama-e-Hind campaigned on behalf of Congress, whilst the Dalit leader Jogendranath Mandal continued to campaign on behalf of the Muslim League. In the Andaman Islands, some 850 miles east of the Indian mainland, inhabited by neither Hindus or Muslims, decisions were made by Delhi politicians who had little familiarity with the region. Congress wanted them to be part of India, the Muslim League lobbied for them to be made a refueling point between East and West Pakistan, the British Navy suggested that they remain British, and a group of Anglo-Indians even proposed that they become a homeland for their community. In the end, Sindh and Balochistan voted to join Pakistan, while Bengal and Punjab voted on partitioning their provinces between the two dominions. Partition committees proliferated, staffed by equal numbers of Muslim and non-Muslim bureaucrats, to divide the country, an exercise tedious in its detail and terrifying in its scope. Their job included dividing everything from rivers to stationary sets. And on the 3rd of July, Alan Campbell Johnson noted in his diary that we considered whether a partitioned India meant also a partitioned kennel club. The solutions to these problems were slapdash, so that on one occasion, the Encyclopaedia Britannica was divided up, with alternate volumes going to each country. Dictionaries were ripped in half, A to K going to one country, and L to Z going to the other. Meanwhile, the Indus, from which the words India and Hindu were derived, was given to Pakistan. A few days later, the partition councils turned their focus to the famed Mohenjo-Daro necklace, an ancient artifact of jade and agate threaded on a golden string, 4,500 years earlier, when the Indus Valley civilization was trading with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Here, the solution was to cut the necklace in half so that an equal number of beads could be sent to India and to Pakistan. Even history, it seemed, would be divided. The question remained, however, who would oversee the division of land. It was Jinnah who finally proposed Cyril Radcliffe, a lawyer and ex-Director General of Britain's Ministry of Information, who was said to be of great legal abilities, right personality, and wide administrative experience. The fact that Radcliffe had never been east of Paris and knew nothing of India was considered to be evidence of his potential as an unbiased mediator. Yet tasking a man who knew nothing of the subcontinent with determining its fate would yield deadly results. Radcliffe was given just a matter of weeks to mark out contiguous areas of Muslims and non-Muslims, while taking into account other factors such as the flow of rivers and the placement of holy shrines. "I was so rushed that I had not the time to go into the details," he later admitted. "What could I do in 1.5 months?" And soon even Mountbatten was beginning to realise what he had done by rushing independence, writing to his daughter Patricia, "I've made such a mess of things through overconfidence and overtiredness. I'm just whacked and worn out and would really like to go. I'm so depressed, darling, because until this stupid mishandling of the Jinnah situation, I'd done so well."
Well, thank you. So we're going to open the floor up to questions. Do you want to go ahead?
Just a question for Sam. You mentioned on the Empire podcast that the story of the Indian National Congress declaring its aim of full national independence had been relegated to somewhat of a footnote in a newspaper from New Year's Day 1928, with the front page story being the BBC's attempt to contact aliens. Did you find that the relegation of stories surrounding the Indian Empire and growing calls for independence leading up to the eventual breakup of the Raj was a theme that was noticeable throughout your research? And if so, do you have any other examples, or was this just a one-off?
So yeah, I think this is the kind of big joke that I opened the book with to try and catch an audience's attention. When I went looking for growing up in Delhi, there was very much this kind of moment when the Indian nationalists joined together to announce their aim is full independence, and this is one of the great turning points. And when I actually went looking for it in the archives, it's bottom right-hand corner, tiny little story, on the front page, but tiny right-hand corner. And the big story that day is essentially that the British Empire is so confident that it's the BBC, now 2 years old, is trying to contact aliens and expand the British Empire into space. And so they say kind of, "Hello all stars and nebulae, have our waves reached you yet?" And there's an awkward pause, and then the aliens don't get back to the poor presenter. So potentially in the future we might have some aliens saying, "Oh yes, we just heard about your lovely," kind of thing. But yes, so it depends. There are some newspapers where obviously Indian news is front and centre. So I think the Military and Civil Gazette, which was published in Lahore, founded partially by, I think, Rudyard Kipling, I think was one of the founders. That's always one of my favourite sources because it's got everything. You can literally just go day by day, and it's got stuff from across the subcontinent in all the different provinces. They've got their correspondence, and it seems to be really kind of diverse. One of the big issues always throughout British imperialism was that, it's an autocracy from India, but it's controlled by a functioning democracy. This is how Amartya Sen always characterised growing up in the British Raj. That you've got this complete autocracy run by a functioning democracy in the West, but where no one really has any idea of what India is about. And so, famously, the way that Amartya Sen writes about the Bengal famine that he lived through and is one of the most important documenters of. Amartya Sen is one of the Nobel Prize winning economists, amazing man, for those who don't know him. he writes about the extraordinary fact that, everyone in Bengal was aware that this famine was killing like 3 million people, right? In 1943, Bengal famine. More people in South Asia die in 1943 than in any other year, despite that being the only year that South Asia wasn't really in any pitched battles during World War II. So other years there were battles against the Japanese. This was the year that everything paused because there were other battles with Japan, and so that there was actually the least fighting but the most civilian deaths this year. He describes how when they managed to get news of the Bengal famine into the news and newspapers of London in high enough places, then suddenly there was always a British response, because the British public were always horrified when they actually learnt about this stuff. But so often these stories just wouldn't make it onto the front page. And I think that a similar thing always happens. People who've researched 1857 always say the same things, that a lot of the news just wasn't getting out here, and that when it did, there often would be tribunals and people would be put to justice. But it was a matter of getting the news to London, because it was this strange thing that the fate of India was controlled by democracy in Somerset, and in Gloucestershire. You had to get those people. You had to turn these things into a political issue in the rural north of England, around Lincolnshire and stuff, in order to actually get anything changed. And so yes, it is a general theme, but there are often certain newspapers that are very much about Indian things. But Taunton Courier, which is where that line comes from. Taunton is in Somerset, and it's quite telling that it's very rare to see India on the front page in Somerset news, and yet it was the people of Somerset who were controlling India's fate. It's the people of the rural highlands. It's all these local British constituencies who unwittingly held the fate of half of the world in their hands.
So when we talked about censorship, so with the Bengal famine, it was only reported after a newspaper editor sort of went
Ian
rogue.
Stevens.
Yeah. So why was that? Like, why was there censorship, and by who?
So that Bengal famine very specifically is a specific issue. That it was the year that the Japanese Empire was trying to invade Bengal, and the Japanese had conquered Burma. They were literally on the frontiers of modern Bangladesh, and in order to try, and basically with everything on a war effort, the viceroy doesn't want everyone to lose morale, and so he tries to hide it. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing. Also, the crucial thing is that I think so much of the Bengal famine was not in the cities. People in the cities, often you hear about people in the Bengal Club, including Bengalis, continuing to eat. Like Amartya Sen, although he's one of the great documenters. I've been chatting to Kavita Puri, who's just done an amazing podcast that you should all listen to, 3 Million, on the Bengal famine. She was talking to me recently about, even Amartya Sen, he was never hungry. For the rich, they were never hungry. It was the working class of rural Bengal who were starving. And there are virtually no books by people who've actually were starving. There's until basically her research, there are very few testimonies about it from the mouths of people who were hungry, because even these elites, these Bengali elites who were writing about it, were still having 3-course meals themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
It's a very simple question. I have a granddaughter who's in her early 20s now, and is always very interested in stories from Pakistan. I come from Pakistan. I'm married to an Englishman. My daughter's married to an Englishman, so we're quite a mixed family. And she feels that she's so ignorant about the colonial history and what I'm British. I'm proud of all the good things British have done, in art and music inventions. But of course, we have this dark history. As a young person, when do you think that this country will start teaching our colonial history in the schools?
That's a very good question, and so and I've got quite a specific answer to that, because when I started Project Astan in 2018 with my friends Persian and Sadia, we were part of this thing called the Partition Education Group that was lobbying in Parliament for exactly this. I'm proud to say that actually, unlike 2017, there are now modules. Like in the last decade, a huge amount has changed. So the hope is that 10 years from now, like if you are Key Stage 3 today, you will now, unlike me, I'm just 28, but when I was going through Key Stage 3, there was basically nothing on this. Today there is. It's still optional, there's still huge amounts to go, but you may have seen in the last few years, South Asian Heritage Month, for example, has become more of a sort of institutionalized thing in Britain. Things are beginning to change. I think particularly around COVID, Black Lives Matter, there was a lot of a push to have more of this thing. I do think that it is absolutely ridiculous that this stuff isn't taught more, and the fact that it's still optional is still awful. It's not just with Desi friends and out in India who you go to Ireland and people aren't like mad at the average British person, and there's a huge amount of warmth and just in the same way as people in the subcontinent, but there is a sort of resentment that people basically just don't know about the Easter Rising and about the famine and about the all of these and about the kind of colonial settlements and about the Troubles. Like, this is a hugely important piece of history that should be at the forefront of the British curriculum and in understanding itself, and it's not. And it's embarrassing when Brits go out there. I think exactly the same way. Like, I luckily did grow up in Delhi. I went to school there, and this was very much part of my curriculum. But I would come back to London, and there, no one else knew anything. And ultimately, I think imperialism, for better or for worse, is the most important thing that Britain's ever done. I think that's Satnam Sangari's line. So, it's the thing that's had the most impact on the globe. Britain ruling the entire globe, and so it's ridiculous that it's not more central. But there is a growing recognition of that, and to give a sense, 10 years ago there weren't textbooks that talked about partition and the Raj and that kind of thing. There now is. It's just a couple of textbooks, but there is now a course. You can now do exams on this stuff. It's still optional, but huge numbers of schools have been taking it up. And so the hope is that we are at the beginning of some sort of change. What that will look like 20 years from now, I don't know. But I think that it's important to recognise how much we've achieved in the last 8 years. And that is a model for, if we continue at this rate, then maybe 10 years down the line, things really will be in a much better place. And, particularly once the generation that's now going through this schooling grows up, then we'll see quite a different reaction. Already I think it was, you mentioned on the Empire podcast, Anita, she was talking about this with her family, about, it's ridiculous that it's not more talked about. And her son was then like, no, we're learning about it right now. And that is something that's changed in the last 5 years, it wouldn't have been part of his school's curriculum. And I think we're still coming to, it's not highlighted enough because it is a major win. So that,
There's a lot. There's hope. Right?
There's hope, and there is movement, and I wish it was highlighted more, because I think that there are a huge number of really amazing people who have been lobbying at Parliament like every couple of months, really amazing people who put in a lot of time, and I don't think that they have gained enough recognition, and I wish that the press reported more on the gains that have been made in exactly that. Obviously, there is still miles to go, but it's something.
Yeah.
And it's not something to...
So it's lovely in there, and there's a few questions that says...
Yeah.
You just said something, you said there's still miles to go, and I wanted to pick up on that, because of course we've seen the inexorable rise of the far right, and pride of Britain's colonial legacy, and you're called woke if you even contest Britain's colonial legacy and the pride in the flag and everything. So is there a risk perhaps that we might be going backwards on the progression of knowledge of the legacy of the British Empire? And especially when it comes to the refugee crisis, as I would love to explain to people that Britain's colonial and neo-colonial involvement in many theatres of the world is the reason why we have such a recurring refugee crisis. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that we're in this kind of ridiculous political cycle right now that's just inane and crap, to use the word. Let's be honest, St. George's flag, where was St. George? He was a Syrian. Yeah. He was a Syrian Christian. Kolkata was British 50 years after the Act of Union with Scotland and 50 years before the Act of Union with Ireland. So, in a sense, Calcutta is as much of a British city as Belfast. The ties are so deep, and our inane political leadership, I think it's to do with years of kind of education that focuses on migration as a new phenomenon. Like I always slightly have a bee in my bonnet about the constant focus on Britain's multiculturalism, somehow beginning with the HM2 Windrush arriving after World War II, as if Britain hadn't already been ruling over most of the world before that. And you literally look at the 1920s, you've got Gandhi and Jinnah are all studying in London. Like, this isn't a new phenomenon. We've got evidence that many of the great cathedrals, and new research by Diana Dark has been showing how a lot of Muslim or Christian craftsmen had come back to Britain with crusaders after the First Crusades, helping to build many of the early Gothic churches. So, these great symbols of British pride, like Wells Cathedral, arguably my favourite Gothic cathedral in Britain. If you haven't been, go, it's absolutely spectacular. Really, the perfect Gothic building in Britain. They've recently discovered that all the sculptures on it are covered with Arabic language mason marks. And that a lot of the early, basically kind of, we're talking around late Norman, about 100 years after 1066, that kind of time, when Richard the Lionheart, Robin Hood, that kind of era. A lot of the great big churches built across the country are built with the help of craftsmen from across the world. Like, Britain's multiculturalism is not a new thing, and I think it's ridiculous to try and pigeonhole it. And the excessive focus of the media on these events, I think that there should be, I'm happy for everyone to be proud of using the St. George's flag, just as long as we remember that he was Assyrian.
First question here.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for such a really illuminating talk. I learned so much myself. Being from that part of the world, I didn't have a clue about most of it. But what I found really interesting is so many of the things that we watch in the news today, of hotspots and everything, to see the origins of those in a much more complex manner, because usually we're told, as you said, through the lens of a particular bias, and all of the particular groups, as you said, have a particular bias. So the question I have is that, given that we are once again or continuously in this state where everybody's blaming everybody else for being perpetrators and everything, and all they're the victims, how do you think we can pursue this history where people don't feel that they are being sort of demonized as a result of it? Because you can demonize all the groups because everybody did terrible things as well. So how can this be more of a learning thing for a different kind of future than the ones that we've inherited over these centuries?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think just more conversations, and I think that one of the things that always slightly frustrates me is that there's all these families across Britain, white families in rural Somerset or Scotland or Highlands or wherever it might be, who have all these fascinating colonial histories. They've got all these documents, and they're almost too scared to talk about it, even though frankly, I think it's only through communication and talking that we can get over these things and move on to a better future. My family has all sorts of colonial backwash in the, my dad's family's from East Lothian, my mum's family's from up in Inverness. Both sides have all sorts of colonial legacies that it's only through chatting about and reading about that you can really move forward. And I think there's far too many people who get too awkward to do that. There's not enough encouragement to have frank conversations about this. And to, I think that Britain's never had I think the average German person, for example, is very aware of all the horrors that were committed in World War II, and no one has to blame the average German on the street now who's living in Hamburg, you know, like, as in we can move on, but it's only after having addressed these systematic inequalities and integrated it into our understanding of ourselves. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a, you know, everything you are and have been is horrendous. There's all sorts of aspects, as you said, of, you know, music and culture and writers who have amazing legacies, and, you know, even some of the people who are just part of our canon already. One of the great anti-colonial thinkers who writes some of the most serious, scathing criticism of the colonial order from the inside, who is never talked about as such, is George Orwell, for example. George Orwell is born in Bihar, worked for years as a colonial officer in Burma, wrote Burmese Days and How to Kill an Elephant, his two early works, as a searing criticism of imperialism, and yet we only ever really hear about him in terms of his criticism of totalitarian communism in 1984 in Animal Farm. You know, he is just undoubtedly like a figure that we can and continue to take pride in. But like, why is it that we never see him talk about him in that light? He also, as a Brit, has, you know, ancestors who profited off the opium wars and that kind of thing. He's a fascinating, interesting figure. He is also arguably one of the greatest anti-colonial thinkers that Britain, like, who is of white British origin, and that should be part of the legacy of how we remember him. And so I think it's complicated. There needs to be more conversation and openness about it. But the way that the media has been kind of, yeah, as you said, like, everything now, any form of conversation about it is turned woke. It's really important to have these conversations, and it shouldn't be controversial to do so. Yeah.
So we'll go to Oliver. It's Oliver, right? And then my aunt at the back.
Hi, I just finished the book actually, and so firstly, congratulations. I think it's a really compelling narrative. I was particularly pleased and moved by the attention to Bangladesh. Actually, I just went to Bangladesh for the first time earlier this year. I was really struck in the National Museum by how little there is on the British period and 1947 compared with 1971. It's very much the defining, as you say in the book, it's very much their bigger definition of identity. Although they now have removed all the pictures of Muji from the as of last year after the revolution. I suppose my question would be, why you say it's a sort of one of the partitions that is perhaps the least known about, maybe along with the Arab world as well, but why do you think that is the case, given what a sort of cataclysmic moment that was and the impact? Why do you think that is the case?
Sure, thanks for that. First, any chance I could grab a glass of water from the back? Yes, if that's possible. So I think that Bangladesh, yes, has a very sort of monolens view of history, where 1971 is kind of the only thing that matters, which I find unfortunate. It loses all sorts of complexity. Also, it means that of all the states that have emerged from the Raj, it looks after its historical monuments the least well. So, you know, the gorgeous early mosques of the Bengal Sultanate, I recently went to Gore, which should be a World Heritage Site, has amazing, some of the best early mosques in South Asia. None of them are protected, and they're just kind of lying there unlooked after. There's no guard, nothing. And you just kind of, and there's no signpost, so we had to look for the monuments for 20 years. 20 minutes before we actually, just like wandering around in the woods, and then we found, some of the great mosques of the 13th century. And the origin of, crucial bit of the story of why Bangladesh exists today. If it wasn't Muslim majority, if this region hadn't turned Muslim around this time, it wouldn't exist as a country. So I find that sad. In terms of why elsewhere, so within Bangladesh, I think that there is a confused understanding to 1947, which is why they ignore 1947. The Great Partition obviously produced the borders of modern Bangladesh, and it was part of Pakistan. But because, the Muslim League that founds Pakistan is actually founded in Dhaka. In 1946, when the big vote on Pakistan's future happens, Bengal is the only province that votes for Pakistan. Punjab doesn't. It doesn't have a Muslim League government in 1946. So it's right at the centre of the demand for Pakistan, but because later all of those same figures fall, there's a kind of embarrassment about that period because it all ends so horribly, because it ends in kind of complete ethnic cleansing and mass murder. It's all seen as a kind of mistake on the bumpy road to the creation of Bangladesh. And so it's the earlier possibilities are sort of flattened out and not really spoken about. In terms of why the rest of the South Asia doesn't talk about 71, I think it's just India and Pakistan are constantly defining themselves, whether they like it or not, in opposition to each other. And there's I think it's just nationalism, the way that these national stories have been told. It's told as a military victory or a military loss to their respective countries, as opposed to the wider story of the emergence of a new nation state. So that's definitely, in India you've always got Vijay Diwas and the kind of celebration of the military victory in the Third Indo-Pakistan War. It's never mentioned. The word Bangladesh is never in there. And yet I think again it's changing. All of these things, earlier it was so raw that people didn't really want to speak about it quite a lot of the time. There was also, so many coups in Bangladesh's history that a lot of the people who helped fight for independent Bangladesh later became disillusioned with Bangladesh. And, depending on whether you are a Awami League supporter or a BNP supporter, or there's a whole complex world there it's still going on. And I mean, this is what I keep saying about, none of these partitions is necessarily over, and all of their legacies, they're all part of modern political debates. But yeah, I mean, it should be much more front and centre. I think that 1971, just as much as 1947, shaped modern South Asia. And I think 1937 should be up there, the year of Burma's creation and the separation of the Gulf states. I think 37, 47 and 71 for me are the big 3 years in 20th century South Asian history.
Okay, so we've got a question at the back, and then after that, just one more question if anybody's got one, and then we'll wrap up.
Just wanted to say thank you so much, Nadia, and for the really inspirational afternoon. Really enjoyed the discussion, and really looking forward to reading your book, actually. I know reading about the Indian history, you hear about the events that happened, and a little bit of an analysis about why it happened, but you don't get the idea of the motivation really behind it all. I mean, I remember reading Jinnah didn't really want to have, didn't want the partition, and then he did, and you're not really sure why that actually happened. So I'm looking forward to sort of going a bit in depth into the book about that. You also sort of get the sense about the mess that was made in this partition, in the way that it happened, and how it continues to impact on the lives and really the story today of the different groups of people. So I mean, I wonder if you can just sort of speak a little bit about that. I also wanted to know if you have any pushback from your book, because your narrative is slightly different to what we've read in the previously. And also, what's your next project now?
Next project, early days, not quite sure. There's several different ideas, everything from, something more focusing on World War II to do with what the Indian Army was up to do with maybe something to do with the breakup of French Indochina into Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Maybe something to do with the ancient world. There's all sorts of different things. Potentially more 20th century South Asian politics, who knows? It's early days. I've just, I think this month, finally had time to begin to think about it. And so I'm still kind of very much moving ideas around. In terms of, what was the other question again, sorry?
So the pushback.
The pushback, yeah. Pushback
that you have today from what happened.
I have been amazed how much everyone has liked it. In terms of, particularly, the book talks quite a lot about Kashmir, Balochistan, 1971, all these quite controversial subject. I'm amazed that I've managed to get away with it so far, and that somehow I've had liberals and right-wingers in both India and Pakistan and Bangladesh have all seemed to like it, so that's really nice. The only pushback that I've had, bizarrely, has been from a bunch of Emiratis who are all horrified to know that Abu Dhabi and Dubai were the lowest ranking princely states of the Raj, and that's really upset them, because the way that they tell their history is, because today the modern politics of kind of South Asian migrant labourers to the Gulf, there's a bit of unease with this history, but by and large it's all been good press. So I'm fingers crossed, very grateful for how it's been received so far. I mean, even I've been amazed by how much because I think that a lot of it's to do with like events that you place next to each other. So there's a bunch of kind of hardcore Muslim nationalists from Pakistan, and then a bunch of guys from the basically RSS Hindu nationalists who've all given positive responses, because both of the things that they feel angry about are in there, but just in chronological order. So I don't know, it's been surprising how it is possible to create some sort of agreement on the order of events. So far, I've not had any. And everyone, particularly Kashmir, I was absolutely terrified before it came out. But again, even Kashmiri friends have been like, that checks out. So
I think it's because there's elements of the missing pieces of the story, and that you're putting that all together. And it's useful to have that context of, for example, Kashmir, because of what happened recently with Pahalgam. And then so many people just didn't know what's going on, and there's a particular narrative, and you're actually explaining what happened. So it's just, for me, it's just okay, this all really makes sense. It helps me to understand it better. So I think that's what it is, that you've touched on something that was really missing.
I think also I think just trying to bring in the complexities, and I think all the countries involved have their nationalist narratives. In all the countries, there's also smaller narratives, and just trying to piece them all together is the only way that you get a general sense of what's been going on. And it's often, I think a key thing is trying to use sources in as many languages as possible. I think a lot of early books on this period tend to only use English language sources, or only use Hindi language sources or whatever. But whereas by bringing in different language sources, and the crucial thing is that the book ends in 75, and right now we basically have I think it's 50 years that things have to stay declassified, right? Classified, and then things begin to get released. So a lot of the stuff that I use in the book is to do with declassified intelligence files in all the countries involved, where you can actually just see what was actually going on. And I think right now, everything up until 1975, unless the way that the releasing of intelligence files happens in all the countries that used to belong to the British Empire, that follow the rules, because often there are some that don't necessarily still follow this. But after 50 years, everything legally has to be released to the public, to archives, except for things that might still create a national security risk. So interestingly, there are certain files that haven't been released to the public, and it's interesting what they are. For example, Prime Minister Nehru's letters to Edwina Mountbatten are still kept from the public in Southampton University for reasons that remain unclear. But that tells you something. And likewise, there's all sorts of files that Pakistan will refuse to release about 1971 that are still impossible to access. But Indian archives have released their files from 1971, and you can see what intelligence they're receiving. Whether or not their intelligence is true, again, we will know more in the future as further things are released, but we can at least see what Indira Gandhi's thinking, but also what the Raw Chiefs are thinking, and also how they're making these judgments on the basis of what information. And you can take now personal. So one of the things that I think particularly a lot of people have found interesting is the work that I've done, and particularly this guy called Avinash Paliwal, who's at SOAS, has done recently on piecing together India-Pakistan's proxy war in the 1960s. So, we all know that in this period, this is the period when India begins funding Bengali separatists and Pashto separatists and Balochi separatists, at the same time as Pakistan begins funding Naga separatists in India, Mizo separatists in India, and Kashmiri separatists in India. And now, for the first, so much of this period has been based on, the odd memoir by someone involved and like kind of Vay's accusatory kind of claims. For the first time ever, about 3 years ago, Avinash Paliwal wrote this book that used all the declassified files, and now we kind of know what happened. And it's amazing how much this history can finally come out, because suddenly we actually have the files that enable us to tell, oh, okay, so this was the order of events, and this was the first time that they started funding a proxy, and then India responded, and then Pakistan responded to that, and then it all spiraled out of control very, very fast. What's amazing is it seems that they basically weren't sponsoring any proxies in the 1950s, and that actually, I think one of the most puzzling things that everyone is amazed by is the fact that RAW and the ISI were actually working together and sharing intelligence through the 1950s to stop communist revolutions. And there's a whole crazy Cold War conspiracy movie that's waiting to come out that's like Pathan, the new Shah Rukh Khan and Deepak Chopra movie, where it's like ISI and RAW, love story kind of thing. And it's like, we need that, but the Cold War version, because it's true.
Next project.
Honestly, like...
Exactly. Okay, we're running out of time, so we'll take your question, and then there's just one more at the back, and then we'll wrap up.
I've actually got comments. So first comment, I'm a big fan of your dad actually, but I think I might be more Team Sam now actually. Number 2 comment, I'm really embarrassed. You're 28, I'm 48. You've got a book behind you, and like I feel like some underachiever, honestly. But third and most important point, just keep doing what you're doing, because it's so important in this time now. I'm in healthcare, and during the COVID time, and everyone's privy to this, right? There was a lot of fake news flying around. We're now moving on to a new era now, where it's all about fake history, right? And it's who controls that narrative. So it's so important what you're doing, and getting the word out and actually saying things for what they are. And to your earlier point about education and the curriculum being updated, it's a fascinating point, because I'm so happy to see that. When I was back in school, 2 miles down the road, we didn't study any of this. But it's interesting, because even though it's in the curriculum now, to the earlier point, how long is it going to be there for? It could be removed, right, given the direction of travel. So you've just got to keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that.
And no, I mean, on the point of education, I think that there is a, like the key thing is it's out now, so it's going to be harder to take away. There's a lot of the things that we worry about would, I think, involve more like, further projects maybe having their funding removed. But the fact that we now have all the textbooks, like you can't get rid of that. They exist now, and we have the files, and if we want to print those textbooks, we can. And I think this is the key thing with writing, is like, and so it's amazing that the progress that we have made, and we need to be proud of that. Yeah.
Exactly. So, final question.
Yes, thank you. Really interesting. And the point that you made about the way that in the Gulf states, the Indians who were working there was particularly interesting, because we have a family member, great-grandfather, who was actually in the British Civil Service, who ends up working in Oman as the finance minister there. And I find it really interesting that now in Dubai, you go there, and there's all this racism, I think, towards sort of people from the subcontinent working there. And I wonder how much you dig into that in this book, and if you don't dig into it too much, that could be another project as well.
So I think it's just I think what happened in the age of Arab nationalism in the 1960s is that nationalisms are all, stories that are made for political purposes. And the stories that emerged in the Gulf states are, these lands of Arab tribes running around with eagles on their shoulders, and white tobes that don't actually make any sense in an era before washing machines. And and actually you look at early 1920s photos, and they are all wearing basically most turbans in Yemen were made in Kashmir, and most outfits were like sherwanis and this kind of thing. And there was a huge variety of styles, and there was a huge amount of internal diversity. But I think that the connections and the fact that the Gulf has, in a sense, been a trading hub for the it's been a global place for centuries. And I think that what has happened when they define citizenship in the Gulf, they very much made the turning point around the time of oil. And oil is kind of in their own internal stories where history in a sense begins. And before that it was a kind of primeval, early, tribal Arab world that was mono-ethnic, which was never the case. And I think that the point is that there was always these huge, diverse trading groups, particularly Balochis and Sindhis. To this day, I talk about there is actually, I think Oman has done by far the best. In Oman and Yemen, there is both much more internal acknowledgement of the diversity of their own pasts. Because Oman was itself an imperial power, it ruled over a lot of the Swahili coast right down to Zanzibar at various points. And so there's a huge black population. They also went far further in recognizing the Desi communities who were living there as actually indigenous. So to this day you can go to Oman and there is a Sheikh al-Banyan, and Banyan tribe is Banyas, like Gujarati Banyas. There's a Sheikh al-Baluchi, which is Balochi. So there are locally recognized communities who have their origins from elsewhere, but who are now recognized as Omani as anyone else, right? And so I think Oman really has done a far better job than, say, the Emirates or Bahrain or Kuwait in terms of recognizing their own internal diversity.
Maybe it's payback because the Indians didn't want the Gulf states pre-oil.
Yeah. So this is again one of the bits of the book that has generated the most press. This weird thing that I think it's in the 1930s, the British government basically offers the new government of India the Gulf states. Do you want them? And there's this line written by the British legation in Tehran who was working on all of this stuff. And he writes that we were surprised by the apparent unanimity of Government of India officials that there was absolutely no interest in controlling the states of the Persian Gulf after we went. So, there was this recognised that there is this kind of lost opportunity for India or potentially Pakistan. These are Muslim majority areas. They could have ended up as part of Pakistan. There's this moment that, is this opportunity that is missed. At the same time, I do think it's important to recognise that actually, had it become part of Pakistan, it would have been massively smaller population, potentially exploited for mineral wealth. A lot of people from that region will say is that actually, had it become attached to either India or Pakistan, it probably would have been far more exploited, and potentially people would have been pushed off their land. So, the far more populous peoples on the subcontinent mainland had control over these oil resources. And so actually it's potentially a good thing, because today the Gulf, unlike Burma or unlike India or Pakistan, everyone still can go to the Gulf. And there is still that, people still, the diversity that is in the Gulf has in a sense remained. But the local indigenous peoples still have control of their own resources, and in some sense it's actually a far better thing that the diversity of the place has been retained. Had it been, it could have ended up like some of the more conflict-ridden zones of South Asia today. There are big separatists. It could have ended up with big separatist movements where the Gulf tried to gain independence, but the army was sent in, and actually, the current situation is beneficial to everyone. It's actually of the Indian Empire that used to be all united. Along with Britain, it's probably the easiest places for Indians and Pakistanis to interact with one another today. To meet and work.
We've got family in India as well as Pakistan, and can't go to India because of the Pakistani passport. It's very, very difficult. So that is somewhere at least we can be.
Exactly. And so I think that's important to remember that India or Pakistan controlling the Gulf wouldn't have necessarily led to an equal relationship, I think is something that,
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sam. It's been a really wonderful afternoon meeting you and talking to you. I've been dying to ask you all these questions for months now, and I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great to have questions from the audience. Time has just flown by, so I'm just conscious that we do have Sam's got books to sell, and also we'll be doing some signings at the back. So if you head there now, and then, but just to thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Maqam Centre. Thanks Dario, as always, for hosting us really well and looking after us. If you want to stay informed about the next events that I'm doing with Golden Threads, I can sign you up to my mailing list, but you can also follow me on YouTube. My channel's Golden Threads. No, it's Nadia Khan History. Yeah, so you can follow me there and stay up to date with the latest events, also with book reviews. And I've noticed that Cat Stevens has got his book out. This is his centre, so I've got my eye on that one.
I love the fact that this is Cat Stevens' centre.
Yes.
Like, I think it's great.
It's a cool place. It's a really cool place.
I had no idea about that until I arrived.
Yeah.
I just think it's wonderful.
So thank you very much. Hope you have a lovely day.